The good ship Sega Saturn set sail back in 1994 and was quickly and soundly blown out of the water by its rivals. The PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 outmaneuvered and outgunned the floundering console, and Sega did plenty to scuttle their own ship too, exhibiting extremely poor sailing skills and questionable navigation. Sorry, this sailing metaphor's got away from me. The point is, the Saturn is now more of a curiosity than an icon. Identifying hidden gems on a console that is something of a hidden gem in itself is an interesting conundrum. With the possible exceptions of Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter, and Daytona USA, pretty much every highly rated Saturn game could be considered obscure in the bigger picture. Go on, shout Burning Rangers from the nearest park bench and see if anyone knows what you're talking about, and whether you get arrested. In this list though, we're looking at hidden gems by Saturn standards, which means we've really had to get the tiny little jeweler's telescope thing out. So set aside Guardian Heroes and forget about Panzer Dragoon Saga, and let's take a real deep dive into some great, unexpected surprises that the Saturn had to offer. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 hidden video game gems for the Sega Saturn. Number 10. Power Slave. Power Slave is a 1984 album by British metal icons Iron Maiden. It's also a Sega Saturn FPS released in 1996. Both of these things have Egyptian themes. Coincidence? No, according to Wikipedia, the name of the game is a direct reference to the album. Whether that's true or not, over here in Europe, the game was actually called Exhumed, so British Saturn fans were unaware of the Iron Maiden link either way. The game is still fairly metal, though, featuring powerful weapons and an alien army invading 20th century Egypt hell-bent on destruction. I can groove to that. Despite eventually being released for the PC and the PlayStation, developers Lobotomy Software opted to release the Saturn version first in an attempt to beat a host of other incoming FPS games to the punch. Even with this gambit, however, Power Slave faded into relative obscurity compared to high-profile PC to Saturn ports such as Quake or Duke Nukem 3D. While it didn't receive totally universal acclaim, it delighted Saturn owners with its groundbreaking graphics and effects, interesting puzzles, and pulse-pounding gunplay. Combining old-school action with that ever-fascinating theme of aliens and ancient Egypt, a conspiracy theorist's favourite, that one, Power Slave is a lot of fun and definitely deserves to be exhumed every now and then. You know, like exhumed, that's what they called the game in Europe. Okay, number 9. Number 9, Mr. Bones. In the dark, dark town, there was a dark, dark street. No, hang on, that's the other skeleton thing. 1996 Saturn title Mr. Bones is absolutely chock full of bony boys, though. The titular character himself is one of them, and he's been raised from the grave by an evil necromancer. Oh, no, wait, hang on. Apparently it's an evil philosopher. I apologise, I just went with my gut there, guys. Either way, in life, Mr. Bones was pure of heart, and even though said heart has long since decomposed, this saved him from becoming part of the mad philosopher's evil skeleton army. The player takes control of Mr. Bones as he aims to save the world from his fellow skeletons, and this is where the game earns its hidden gem status. You see, in addition to its oddball premise, which fans of Halloween and spookiness are sure to adore, Mr. Bones is unique in the gameplay department. What first appears to be a comedic action platformer is soon revealed to be a mashup that drastically changes the gameplay styles from level to level. Rhythm gameplay, memorization puzzles, and more sit amidst numerous variations of the action platformer genre, coming together to provide an experience like no other. Some reviewers at the time even threw the word genius around when appraising its design, but sadly, nowadays it mostly resides in the closet with all of your other skeletons. Number 8. Baku Baku. Baku Baku, known as Baku Baku Animal in Japan, is a falling block puzzle game with an intriguing gimmick. The blocks here are either food types or little animal faces. Match an animal with its preferred snack, and watch the critter greedily chow it all down before disappearing and taking the food blocks with them. It's a wacky premise that lends itself to some interesting gameplay, in which matched food blocks won't disappear unless the correct animal block is placed beside them. Baku Baku was met with critical acclaim, with almost all reviewers claiming that the game's addictive nature would eat up your time quicker than the little bunny block eats up all of the little carrot blocks. Surprisingly, the game also has a vague storyline to back up its unusual premise, concerning a spoiled princess who wants hundreds of pets but can't be bothered to look after them. The players therefore take on the role of zookeepers hired by the king to maintain his lazy daughter's menagerie. Incidentally, Baku Baku was the bonus game thrown in with the 1998 Sonic and Garfield pack. What a combination. Maximum hyperactivity collides with maximum laziness. The spiky blue irresistible force meets the bloated orange immovable object, and all with one of the Saturn's greatest hidden gems in between them as a surprising little bonus filling. It's kind of like a really, really strange sandwich. Number 7. Dark Savior. Genre-spanning and unusual, isometric fighting adventure puzzle game Dark Savior is one of the Saturn's most enigmatic releases. The story follows bounty hunter Garion as he escorts dangerous monster criminal Bilan, if I'm saying that right, to an island prison. If you're going to go ahead and assume that the scary murder monster escapes, then, well, yeah, you'd be spot on. Players join Garion on the transport ship just as the inevitable happens. Things soon become a lot less predictable, though. Depending on how quickly players make it to the ship's bridge to save the day, the plot will diverge into 5 vastly different paths, each of them featuring unique areas and story elements. This could be Garion uncovering a corrupt prison warden, a bizarre fighting tournament featuring some of the most dangerous prisoners ever incarcerated, or a delightful jaunt through the trail of corpses left by Bilan if the player let him get away. Dark, strange, and somewhat clunky by today's standards, Dark Savior sits quietly in the dim halls of gaming history, its odd atmosphere and bizarre story twists lost to time. Until a retrospective like this one shines a light on it for a couple of minutes. Enjoy the limelight while it lasts, Dark Savior. It's back to the shadows soon. Number 6. Astal. An example of a game that hit the shelves just as its genre was going out of fashion, Astal was a victim of poor timing. This side-scrolling platformer uses hand-drawn animation to striking effect. While these days we're used to 2D adventures with eye-catching art styles, Astal was unusual at the time. It may seem like a stretch to say it was a precursor to the likes of Odin Sphere and Ori and the Blind Forest, but when you compare them visually, it's easy to believe this was at least a stepping stone. Astal himself, who appears to be some kind of perpetually angry little owl boy, was created by the goddess Antowas to protect Leda, a girl granted the power of life. Leda is then kidnapped twice in the build-up to the game's story, and Astal has been banished to the moon. Not the best start to a new job. Players take control of Astal as he jumps, pounds, throws, and blows his way through picturesque levels filled with bizarre creatures and strange landscapes. Reviewers at the time were fairly unimpressed, branding Astal as dated and an example of a dead genre with no place on a 32-bit console. Here in the future, however, we've evolved to the point that we can appreciate a good game regardless of genre, technology, or number of dimensions. It turns out that Astal is one such good game, a pretty and entertaining adventure that just arrived slightly too late. No wonder he looks so angry all the time. Number 5. Elevator Action returns. Publisher Taito wanted to get straight to the point when they named this one. Elevator Action Returns features elevators and action. Also, it's a sequel. That's where the word returns comes from. It's not some kind of bonus level in which players have to fill out tax forms. Starting life in Japanese arcades, it was ported exclusively to the Saturn, but never made it to the West. Shame really, because it's pretty darn good. The aim of the game is to clear each stage by gunning down terrorists and entering all of the red doors before proceeding to the exit. Why only the red doors? Why all of them? Why question it, I would say. Players who don't hang around asking silly things can expect to be treated to fast-paced, challenging, and surprisingly violent action sequences as they attempt to beat the clock, and that is what's important. It's good, old-fashioned action movie stuff. Cool characters armed to the teeth and saving the day. No moral ambiguity, no twists, best, nothing thought-provoking, just bullets and explosions. Despite import reviews at the time being fairly lukewarm, its reputation has been somewhat elevated in recent years, with modern observers identifying it as a beautifully put together arcade action classic. Going up. Number 4. Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldian. There's something to be said for a comfortably familiar turn-based JRPG. The gaming equivalent of a cup of hot chocolate and a pair of fluffy slippers, Albert Odyssey: Legend of Eldian, possibly Eldine, who's to say, has all of the ingredients for a bit of cozy downtime. Delightfully cutesy sprites, lush backgrounds, pleasant music, and a not too taxing fantasy storyline all combine for a classic experience. Makes me feel all warm and fuzzy just thinking about it. By the time of its North American release in 1997, Albert Odyssey was already seen as somewhat dated. It was released in the same month as the more prominent Shining the Holy Ark, a game that presented players with a full 3D world to explore and had the Shining legacy behind it. The story, atmosphere, and music of Albert Odyssey all managed to impress despite its weighty opposition though, and RPG fans choosing between the two were in for a treat either way. Albert Odyssey is an example of a game well worth tracking down for those who have a soft spot for RPGs of a bygone era. Number 3. Assault Suit Lenos 2. When it comes to mech games, you're likely to picture a 3D third or first-person shooter, in which one controls a gigantic machine with long-range weapons, and the occasional bout of robot fisticuffs. If you're thinking about mech games specifically for the Saturn, then, well, you're likely to picture Virtual On, Sega's one-on-one mech-based arena combat game. The Japan-only Assault Suit Lenos 2, though, fits into neither of these subgenres, and instead takes a 2D side-scrolling route. The Saturn was released at a time when 2D games were quickly going out of fashion. But Assault Suit Lenos 2 provided a compelling argument for keeping them around, with its attractive yet gritty visuals, rocking soundtrack, and relentless action. The game features customizable loadouts in which players can choose from 50 different weapons. Once suitably equipped for carnage, the levels are visceral affairs, featuring constant gunfire and non-stop explosions. There's also an interesting story going on. Probably. I can't actually read any of this, but the characters look cool, so that's good enough for me. Number 2. 3 Dirty Dwarves. Right, let's take a moment to figure out what's going on here. 4 children are playing some approximation of Dungeons & Dragons in a secret government facility and are somehow able to summon their characters into the real world. These characters, 3 dwarves with questionable hygiene standards, now have to save the children from the government agents that imprisoned them in the first place. Or something. Also, the dwarves aren't actually that short. And is one green? That's a goblin or a gremlin or I don't know what that is, but it's not a dwarf. Regardless, this humorous and delightfully nonsensical premise is the setup for what amounts to an offbeat and highly enjoyable side-scrolling beat-em-up. Fantasy tropes are mixed into a grungy modern-day setting, and we're left with visuals that look like the 1978 animated Lord of the Rings had a baby with something like recess. The game's graphics and humour were praised at the time, and most reviewers liked the gameplay too, although many declared that the beat-em-up genre was becoming dated. Have you noticed a pattern here in pretty much every entry? These days, we know that classic gaming genres age like fine wines, and 3 Dirty Dwarves is a fine example of an old-fashioned beat-em-up game. It's not going to grace any best games ever lists, but it is unfairly overlooked, and worth a shot if you can get your hands on a copy. And number 1, Dragon Force. Unless you're a hardcore Saturn enthusiast, chances are you're currently picturing finger-blasting guitar solos. But that's Dragon Force one word, the British power metal band responsible for notorious epic Through the Fire and Flames. Dragon Force, 2 words, is different. It's what happens when the grand strategy of the Total War series meets the cutesy fantasy of classic 2D JRPGs, and what a surprisingly delightful mashup it is. Players begin the game by choosing from one of 6 available rulers, and are then thrust into a fascinating combination of strategy, tactics, and story. Players will spend a lot of time contemplating a map of the continent, ordering their generals from castle to castle, and making very important strategic decisions. Once 2 opposing armies clash, the game shifts into side-on battlefields, in which adorable little soldiers, dragons, and samurai slaughter each other by the hundreds. With a fascinating story that's told differently depending on which ruler you choose, there's a huge potential for replayability here, and there are hours and hours of thoughtful fun to be had. Despite being overshadowed by a group of long-haired Londoners with guitars and a similar name, Dragon Space Force really is the shiniest of all the Saturn's hidden gems.